Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for Policy Studies webinar. My name is Eamon Ives. I'm the Head of Energy and Environment Policy here at the CPS, and I'll be your chairperson for today. I'm joined by a distinguished panel who I shall introduce in a moment, but I'd first like to just give a little bit of context for our discussion. The focus of today's webinar will be on trade and the environment, which are two clear objectives for the current government, especially as we begin to emerge from the worst of the coronavirus pandemic. On the trade front, there is now clear blue water between the UK and the EU, with the Brexit transition period well behind us, and the UK is seeking to stake out its position as an independent trading nation once again. On the environment, we know without doubt that this is something which the Prime Minister is particularly enthused about, and with COP26 only getting nearer, is a policy area where the government really wants to burnish its credentials on the global stage. This webinar comes after the publication of our report, Clean Free Trade, in which we examined how, contrary to common assumption, international free trade and the environment can be mutually reinforcing objectives, provided the right policy frameworks are in place. You can find that report easily enough on our website, and I would really recommend that you all give it a read. Though as the person who wrote it, I might be a little bit biased in saying that. We published Clean Free Trade with the support of the Conservative Environment Network, who have helped organise this webinar as well, so I should take a minute to say thank you to their team. One final bit of housekeeping before we begin. During the second half of the webinar, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So you can get those in using the Q&A box. And please don't wait to do so, especially if you want to react to anything which our panelists have said. Alternatively, you can tweet us using @CPS Think Tank, and we'll pick those up there. But without any further ado, let's introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Gideon Mp, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central. She was elected in 2019, winning the seat for the Conservative Party for the first time in its history. To save her any awkwardness later on, she will need to leave us a little before the end to get off to a Westminster Hall debate. But Jo, if you'd like to kick us off, please go right ahead.
Thank you. 2021 is a big year for the health and well-being of people and the planet. COP26 and COP15 are crucial opportunities to transform how we tackle the root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss. The global impact of COVID-19 has made us all aware of the fragility of our existence and the need to work together on the sustainability of our planet. I believe we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make the necessary fundamental changes as we build back better. As countries emerge from the coronavirus, they will implement better policies, I hope, to restart and rebuild their economies. I chair the all-party parliamentary group on the National Food Strategy, which looks at the food system as a whole, including food standards. And the report has just published some interesting findings. So, for instance, when it comes to making new trade deals, the recommendation is that the government should only agree to cut tariffs on products which meet our core standards. And this is also a recommendation of the Trade and Agricultural Commission. We need to draw up a list of minimum core standards to defend in any future trade deals, and then set out the mechanisms that are necessary to protect those standards. Otherwise, I think there is a risk that cheap imported food could undermine our efforts to protect the environment. And looking at the priorities for COP26, obviously a clean economic recovery, a phase out of coal-fired power generation, expanding nature-based solutions like tree planting, and mandating financial actors to actually integrate climate risks in future investment decisions. I think that's a key issue, and accelerating adaptation to climate change. Trade plays a key role in our ability to make the necessary transition. Currently, the supply chain to deliver key elements of our green industrial revolution is not wholly available from UK suppliers. In emerging technologies, the tools to tackle environmental issues need to be sourced and shared globally, and there needs to be a level playing field as businesses transition to cleaner energy. I come from Stoke-on-Trent and obviously champion the ceramics industry. Ceramics manufacturing is highly energy intensive, and energy and climate related costs represent up to 30% of total production costs. This sector has already taken extensive action to decarbonise and has some of the world's most efficient ceramic manufacturing operations. However, deeper decarbonisation requires the development and deployment of breakthrough technologies, including hydrogen, electrification, bioenergy and carbon capture, predominantly in locations away from industrial clusters. All UK ceramics manufacturers operate in fiercely competitive, price-driven global markets, and therefore the sector's success is fundamentally reliant on internationally competitive energy and carbon costs. To forge a clean industrial base, urgent action is needed to ensure the costs paid by UK manufacturers match those of competing nations. Otherwise, the alternative will be further UK deindustrialisation and emissions offshoring. One of the three pillars of the government's Global Britain strategy is the UK's role as a champion of free and open trade. And I welcome opportunities for UK businesses, such as our world-leading offshore wind sector, to develop and export low-carbon goods and services to other countries during the global transition to net zero. This will benefit UK businesses by increasing their sales overseas, but will also help other countries reduce their emissions in a cost-effective way and confirm our commitment to be a global leader on sustainability.
Thank you for that, Joe. Lots to pick up on there for our discussion later. I've already made lots of little notes myself. So I shall now turn to our next panelist, Sam Lowe. Sam is a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform and is a leading expert on all things to do with trade policy. He has also recently published some work of his own looking at how countries can deal with the question of emissions being imported into economies through carbon-intensive goods. So Sam, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I always think trade and environment is quite an interesting topic to discuss, not only because I have a slight history of working in that space, but also because different people approach the question in very different ways. Insofar as for some, it's a case of how do you use trade to encourage innovation, open up new opportunities for market access to help create the industries of the future that will help address the climate crisis. For others, they view trade policy as a tool to encourage regulatory reform elsewhere in the world. So you place conditions on market access for goods entering your own territory in the hope that it leads foreign countries to implement their own regulation that can help deal with climate change or carbon pricing or the like. And then for others, that it's sort of a sideshow, but an important one insofar as it's a necessary part of creating the political space for domestic action on climate change. So by this I mean creating an environment in which your own producers don't feel that they're facing unfair competition and therefore don't oppose your measures to get to net zero. And all of these are very important, but they're all actually slightly distinct discussions, right? And there's overlap, but it means that often people end up talking past each other. But what I'm going to just focus on in this brief intervention is two of the recommendations in your report. So the first, which I'm only going to touch on very briefly, is the suggestion that the UK joins the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. And now this agreement would very much fall in the first category that I discussed, in that it's about removing tariffs on environmental goods. It's about disciplining for fossil fuel subsidies. It's about creating an open market for countries to trade goods that will hopefully be beneficial for the environment. And I think it's something that's very important. And I know one of the representatives on this panel is from a country that's very much involved with that, Iceland, but it's also the people involved in negotiating include Switzerland, New Zealand, Fiji, and some others. And the UK has been considering joining it, but I'm actually just going to make a slight point here in that the UK has had cold feet recently, and I just want to make this point because I hope it changes its mind, in that despite the UK having a good history here in terms of unilaterally removing tariffs on environmental goods for the most part when it introduced its new global tariff, in the context of joining this agreement, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, the UK is dragging its feet because it's identified 23 tariff lines it does not want to liberalise, some of which are only tariffs of 2% or which is no more than a nuisance tariff. So that's something I hope the UK will change its mind on. And I also know it's struggling to align with the approach to fossil fuel subsidies, which is something that I'm sure can be worked out. So there's some work to do there, but hopefully we can get involved with the negotiations prior to COP, so that can be a good news story. But the second issue I'm just going to focus on very briefly is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is quite a mouthful. People refer to it as CBAM, or in the past referred to it as border carbon taxes. And the reason it's no longer referred to as a border carbon tax by most people, including the EU in particular, is that as soon as you use the word tax, it creates some legal issues when it comes to WTO compatibility that are perhaps not there if it's treated as a regulation. But beyond that, it is something that's being considered by the EU, but also in the US. The Democrats today have tabled a proposal to introduce their own border carbon adjustment mechanism. And you've also got the Canadians thinking about it as well. And it's something the UK really needs to consider and put some concentrated thinking into. And the reason for that is twofold. There's the external dimension. If the US and the EU were to introduce their own border carbon adjustment mechanisms, which would see a charge placed upon imports equivalent to the carbon content of those products, we're thinking carbon intensive products such as steel, fertilizer, aluminium and the like. If the EU and the US were to do that and make it more expensive for those products to be sold into their markets, those products are going to look for somewhere else to go. And they could end up being dumped, if we use sort of trade terminology, onto the UK market. And that in and of itself could undermine some of the UK's own objectives in this space if producers start to moan about all of these high carbon products suddenly finding their way onto the UK market, whereas UK producers are being asked to uphold high standards and pay a high carbon price. The internal dimension of this debate, which is, I think, more important, is that whilst carbon leakage, by which I mean industry offshoring itself because of high carbon charge in the UK or strict environmental regulation, whilst carbon leakage hasn't been a problem in the UK up until now, it's very difficult to find any evidence of this. We've got to assume that the carbon price in the UK is going to increase significantly in the coming years. I mean, it has quite recently, right? Because of the government's net zero ambitions. So the possibility that companies are going to move out of the UK because of this additional burden does increase. And if that were to happen, if there was to be offshoring and general reduced competitiveness as the result of the government's net zero agenda, I think this could lead to a backlash and to greater opposition against UK action on climate change in general. And a carbon border adjustment mechanism is potentially a partial answer to this question, in that if we require imports into the UK to pay the same carbon cost as goods produced domestically, then you do at least have a level playing field. And there is less of an incentive for companies to move abroad. This isn't an easy discussion. I've never been a border carbon adjustment mechanism evangelist. I've been quite opposed to it in the past, but I think the political economy has changed and also the international context has changed. And whilst it may never happen, the EU might never introduce its mechanism, the US might never introduce its mechanism, it's looking more possible than ever. And I do think it's something the UK needs to discuss, needs to engage with, and not just sit on the sidelines as everyone else moves ahead.
Thank you very much, Sam. Lots and lots to explore further there, I'm sure. Before hearing from our next guest, I'd just like to remind everybody watching that you can get your questions into our panelists now. We've already had some come in, but I'm sure we'll have time for lots more. So please do that on the Q&A function. Up next is Áslaug Anna Sigurjónsdóttir. I hope I got that pronunciation right. Áslaug is the Minister for Justice in the Icelandic government, a position she has held since 2019. I'd be very interested to hear her thoughts on international trade, especially given that not even 2 weeks ago, her government's foreign minister was in London signing a free trade agreement between the UK and Iceland, with Norway and Liechtenstein as well. So Áslaug, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to join this interesting and important discussion today. It has, of course, sometimes been seen as two opposites, to be a conservative and prioritize protecting the environment, or that capitalism and the free market are by definition bad for the environment. This perception is fortunately becoming a thing of the past, and it is in fact quite the opposite. The free market has a role to play in addressing environmental challenges, and it is up to governments to create the conditions to make trade part of the solution. The world faces, of course, big environmental challenges, and we must work to protect the environment on all fronts. and of course adapts to sustainable way of life. And we know that global economic transformation is needed in order to reach the goals set forth in the Paris Agreement, for example. And here trade has an important part to play. Trade can make the transition to low emissions, climate resilient, and sustainable economies happens quicker and smoother than otherwise. And this is the main reason why Iceland decided to join the initiative for an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, along with New Zealand, Norway, Costa Rica, Switzerland, and Fiji. And we want to explore how we can use trade policy and trade rules to tackle climate change and other environmental challenges. And the agreement intends to remove tariffs on environmental goods and create new commitments on environmental services. Also to establish concrete commitments to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsides and develop voluntary guidelines for eco-labeling programs and mechanisms. And the aim is to show in decisive manner how trade policy and trade rules can and should be used to address environmental challenges. Trade therefore becomes a big part of the solution and helps spread environmentally friendly goods, services, and solutions. And the agreement will be open to other WTO members that have the same environmental ambitions to join, and we hope it will create a momentum maybe for many other countries to follow suit. Consumers increasingly make decisions with the impact of the environment in mind, and by removing trade barriers for some products and services that are environmentally friendly, governments can help to make that choice easier for consumers as well. And companies also increasingly realize that they have to meet these demands of the markets in order to be able to continue to grow. The agreement will, I believe, also help businesses prioritize the production of goods and services that are good for the environment by giving them a comparative advantage and ease their access to markets. And it is also important for emerging economies that access to the environmentally friendly goods and services is made easier so that development can go hand in hand with protecting the environment. Iceland would, of course, welcome the participation of the UK in the initiative. As pointed out in the report, Clean Free Trade, that is the basis for our discussion here today. The participation of the UK as a G7 economy and a major international player, and of course as the host of the COP26 in Glasgow later this year, would significantly increase its reach and encourage more countries to join. We work, of course, closely with the UK on trade and sustainability, as well as other issues, and we welcome every opportunity to further our cooperation. Our biggest priority is free trade and creating the best opportunities for Icelandic businesses abroad. The importance of free and open international trade and entering into more free trade agreements to lift barriers to trade has been a continuous effort during our time in government, and we have made a good process. Earlier this month, as was mentioned here before, Minister of Foreign Affairs, along with his EEA and EFTA colleagues, and the British Minister for International Trade, Mr. Ranil Yaviaranda, or our new free trade agreement that regulates trades between our countries. And my government also prioritizes sustainable development and protecting the environment. And in our government platform for cooperation, we highlight that when FTAs are negotiated, special attention shall be given to promoting environmental issues and human rights, including women's rights. And I'm glad to say that our new agreement contains robust commitments on sustainable development, including on climate change, biodiversity, and other important environmental challenges, and emphasizes the role of trade in addressing these challenges. I welcome also that we have a special section on women economic empowerment in our chapter, on trade and sustainable development, and EFTA has included chapters on trade and sustainable development in all new and updated agreements since 2010. And this is the first time, however, that Iceland concludes an agreement with provision on trade and women's economic empowerment. And this topic is, as I've explained, a high priority for Iceland, and as well an area that we have been working on with the UK, particularly in Geneva. But Iceland and the United Kingdom are allies on many fronts. You are our close neighbor and friend, and our second biggest trading partner after the United States. And I look forward to deepening our cooperation through our new free trade agreement and in the field of international trade overall. But in the end, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate here today, and I look forward for our discussion on this important issues today, and I hope you learned something from my words here today. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Aslog. And yeah, so interesting to get your perspective on things. Being that sort of Icelandic voice on our panel. Now, last but by no means least, I shall turn to our final guest, the Right Honourable Greg Hands MP. Greg is the Member of Parliament for Chelsea and Fulham, and most importantly for today's purposes, the Minister of Trade Policy in the Department for International Trade. So, Minister, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Eamon, and thank you to all of my fellow panelists. It's a great event with two of my favourite groups, the CPS, with which I've had long-standing connections, and also the Conservative Environment Network, which it's got the various guises over the years. I think started as the Conservative Green Policy Group. I can't even remember now, but it's a really strong group, a caucus of Conservative MPs in the House of Commons who have a strong and fundamental belief in the environment, fighting climate change, and so on. And we've actually, if I may say so, been of some significant influence on UK government policy over a considerable amount of time. I still remember when we kind of broke, going back to what Aslog said about how centre-right parties can define themselves as being environmental parties. You know, in the Conservative Party, we coined the expression vote blue, go green, as long ago as I think about 2006, as being the solution as to how the centre-right is actually the natural party of the environment. And Eamon, thank you also for your report on green free trade and the, if you like, the 5 main recommendations that you made. And if I today, the short time available, I'd like to make 5 points from me as well on behalf of the government as to where the UK is, and I'll try and answer some specific points that Sam Lowe and Aslog mentioned in relation to ACTS and CBAM. First of all, just my first point would be this: the UK to show global leadership. You know, we are the first country to have created a legal commitment to become net zero by 2050, and I think we have been in those years, the last decade or so, showing the way politically, exactly as my Icelandic colleague said, sort of showing that you can grow the economy whilst reducing emissions. Now, I'm a little bit older, but I remember my first election as an adult, really, was in the UK, the 1989 European elections, where we had a proposition, the UK Green Party. It was their most successful ever election in UK political history, the 1989 European Parliament elections. Obviously, we don't have those anymore, but the European Parliament election, 1989, and the Green Party put forward a proposition that the only way to save the environment was to reduce growth or have no growth. And that was their election platform. And it was their most successful election ever. They still finished way behind ours and way behind the Labour Party. But nonetheless, I think they made a point. But we have successfully proven them entirely wrong, because in the UK, since that election, or since 1990, the UK economy has grown by some 70%, 70%, whilst emissions have actually gone down by 44%. So in just my adult lifetime, you know, we have, if you like, defeated the central proposition of a sort of a leftist green agenda and shown that a centre-right green agenda is the winning formula. You know, people won't vote to make themselves poorer. People will vote to make themselves better off and take action on the environment as well. So that's what I'd say in terms of global leadership. Secondly, putting our money where our mouth is. Actually, the UK, we've invested a lot of government money, directly or indirectly, into our renewable sector. Back in 6 years ago, when I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, so the UK's budget minister, we decided to build on decisions made in the coalition government to actually really improve our renewables offer, particularly on offshore wind. I was told at the time it's incredibly expensive offshore wind, and it's not a technology, it's a technology with an uncertain future. But we took the view that it would become more cost-effective offshore wind as you scaled up and as technology riding with the technological improvements on offshore wind. And in that time, we've created the world's largest offshore wind capacity, 10 gigawatts of power. We're going to quadruple that over the next decade. We're also mobilizing £12 billion of government spending to support. And we're also actually, in my area on trade, we're actually now exporting this capability. In recent times, I've been in Korea, I've been in Vietnam, I've been in Taiwan, and actually marketing UK expertise on offshore wind enables us to get export wins in those markets. The third area is on tariff policy, if you like, where it all starts. You know, where is your starting point on your tariff? We took the EU's common external tariff and we turned it into a UK global tariff. We've done three things with that tariff. We have lowered it, we've simplified it, and we've greened it. So we've removed 104 different environmental goods entirely from the tariff, steam turbines, bicycle parts, and so on, as showing not only a reduction in tariffs on green goods, but also a clear statement of UK policy after Brexit. The fourth area is in our free trade agreement agenda, which is, if you like, my area of government. Writing in environmental chapters, making sure that our commitments elsewhere are affirmed, working together, regulatory cooperation, all of these things. And Ursula is absolutely right to recognize the UK EEA agreement as really being a trendsetter in this space, and actually goes further than many other agreements. It's actually a real kind of cutting edge agreement in that. So an environmental chapter and doing more on the environment through a free trade agreement, and actually could be the key to unlocking a free trade agreement with the United States coming forward, as well as the importance of labor in that. Liz Truss was in Washington last week, and we are trying to get the free trade agreement negotiations restarted, and labor and the environment, I think, will be two of the key areas. The recent agreement in principle with Australia, the first time Australia has written the Paris Accord into a free trade agreement, are combined commitments of the Paris Accord. So there's a lot you can be doing. New Zealand, with whom agreement in principle is coming very soon, is a great innovator on trade agreements, which we've already referred to in reference to acts. And the final area is really on a multilateral and global fora, the G7, the WTO, COP26, looking at plurilateral agreements at the WTO, using the trade track at the G7, looking at obviously COP26 and the relevant parts of the trade agenda. So that's what I would say in terms of the UK's presence in those key multilateral fora. Let me just come back on two issues on acts, and I have looked very carefully at acts, and I'm a natural enthusiast for joining these plurilateral agreements, particularly when it comes to the environment. I think we do have two issues with acts. One is that it sort of creates, as far as I understand it, do correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding, it sort of creates two tiers of members. That there's the founding members who conclude negotiation with new members, but other newly joined members do not have those same rights. So I'm a little bit concerned about what appears to me to be effectively like a two-tier membership. And secondly, and it's brilliant, by the way, some of the most innovative countries in free trade agreements are smaller countries. I've already mentioned New Zealand. Chile is a great innovator. Singapore is a great innovator. Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland are also great innovators on trade agreements. Obviously, we have to be a little bit careful in our larger economy and a more diverse economy than typically smaller countries. Sam is right in terms of some of the tariff lines. There's also we have to sort of wonder where the agreement is going. You know, if the UK were to join, what is the potential for it to grow much beyond that? You know, if we were to see competitor economies making the same commitments, then I think that would also be extremely helpful. I realize there's also a first joiner, a premium, if you like, for a major economy, but we also have to look at what other economies are doing in that space. So look, on ACS, I am a natural enthusiast for what is in ACS. I think just those two particular aspects I'd be keen to explore a little bit further. And just on carbon border adjustment mechanism, look, I mean, we have to recognize the risk of carbon leakage, but we also have to make sure that the empirical base is there. We have to make sure these things are measured and can be measured properly, an accurate measurement of the carbon content of goods, some kind of international acceptance of that evidence base. As yet, I don't think that data is widely available and is in many cases difficult to produce. We also have to make sure that it's WTO compliant and will not discriminate against genuine developing nations as well. But having said that, we follow the EU's proposal closely. We've also had discussions of this at the G7 as well. The UK clearly, we will want to be a global leader in recognizing carbon leakage. We just think that the empirical, more work needs to be done, I think at this stage, on creating a more widely accepted data range and a methodology for calculating carbon leakage. So let me end there, because I think, Eamon, we're kind of eating into the question time, but hopefully that's answered where the UK is on ACS and CBAMs and gives you an idea of where I see the UK heading in the years ahead when it comes to the environment. Thank you, Eamon.
No, thank you, Minister. And yeah, I think that sets us up very well for the rest of the webinar. I'm conscious that Joe's probably got to go quickly, so I'll get one question into her right now. Joe, you mentioned about sort of the level playing field when it comes to, say, energy-intensive industries like those in your constituency. So are you kind of tempted by something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism? Do you think that's a way to kind of reconcile that issue that could crop up in the future?
Well, I'm certainly tempted to encourage manufacturing as a really important part of levelling up traditional industrial areas such as Stoke-on-Trent. And I think that in order to do that, we just need, yes, we need that level playing field. How we achieve that, whether it's, you know, you could look at subsidy. I mean, obviously now post-state aid rules, you know, that might be an option, but it would be nice if we could find some sort of harmonious solution across, well, a global solution. But you know, I'm not naive enough to think that there won't be people who want to be competitive through their energy savings. So I think we do need to bottom that out, especially in the sorts of industries that are very heavy on their energy usage.
Certainly, thank you. And maybe I'll go sort of following from that, Sam. You published a report a few weeks before our report, sort of on this whole issue of sort of a CBAM, and is there anything that sort of maybe the minister said that you want to pick up on or push back on, or anything like that? Is that around sort of border adjustment mechanisms?
So I don't really want to push back in that I don't disagree with what Greg said in that the actual data quality in this space is really poor, and if the UK could be a part of improving that discussion, I would seriously welcome it. I suppose I just caution against just using that as an excuse to not engage with the discussion any further at all, just because despite the data quality not being there, the EU is moving ahead with this, right? We've got the full published proposal after it got leaked multiple times before, and we can see it's going to be something that really does impact the UK. The UK is one of the countries most exposed to it, despite us having a carbon price, because at the very least our exporters will be exposed to the bureaucracy of it, which does point to an issue with carbon border adjustment mechanisms in that they can actually constrain trade as well. But the US also you know, the Democrats have tabled something today, and it's a bit mad in that the US doesn't even have its own domestic carbon price, and it's looking to apply a carbon price to imports into the US, right? So, but this is all happening around us. So just to say, oh, we're not sure, we've got to be tentative, we've got to take it slowly. If no one else is taking it slowly, then I just worry the UK will end up being bounced into something it's had no role in designing and no role in shaping the discussion of. And we don't really need to get into it now, but also when it comes to the EU CBAM, there's a huge Northern Ireland question. And I think that's a discussion for another day, but it's really there, and it's really going to potentially be quite complicated.
Certainly will be. And yeah, thank you for those thoughts. I'm going to park the acronym of CBAM and move on to ACCTS now and pivot to Alstoy. So Iceland, a member of this agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. You sort of mentioned that perhaps that's something you'd be open to the UK joining. Would you sort of welcome that? It's something we called for in our report. And sort of what do you sort of see as the main benefits from that to advance sort of climate action at a global level?
Thank you, and of course we would welcome them. Like I said before, the participation of the UK could be very important for this discussion, and to make it on a higher level and to improve and encourage more countries around the world to join in and see the benefit you can have on everything, the country, the business, the companies. I mean, it is, you need to see it from different fields as well. And all these issues where people and countries commit to promoting the development in this area, if it is in international trade and investment in manner that contributes to sustainable development, we underline and improve the high standards we want to have when it comes to, for example, the environment. And I think we can promote and facilitate foreign investment and trade goods and services that contribute to sustainable development even more if more countries would take part in that. And we, of course, have so good commitment to discussing everything with the UK, and just want to keep that on. And I think trade and sustainable development will also be discussed in a specific subcommittee when it goes further on, for example, with the free trade agreement between the EU and EFTA and the UK. It will definitely help the environment, and I think that's a very important step we have already taken, and the agreement opens up channel for such cooperation as well.
Wonderful, yes. So it sounds as if there's an open door there. So Greg, I'm just going to come back to you very quickly before we go to questions from the audience. Something you mentioned around sort of tariff policy. The UK has made some big steps here, particularly coming out of the Brexit transition period. We've had the UK global tariff, which swept away a lot of tariffs and simplified others. Do you think there's potential for that to go further? Sam mentioned there is still some product lines which still attract tariffs. Do you think, are you optimistic for the potential to get rid of a few more of those pesky tariffs?
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks. I mean, I would say we have gotten rid of a lot of tariffs. We've simplified the common external tariff, and as I mentioned, 104 tariffs on environmental goods. And you may well ask, well, why don't we get rid of all tariffs? And obviously there'll be some sensitive industries in the UK. There'll also be some things that we are, if you like, storing up for negotiation capital. You know, that if we were to reduce or remove a specific tariff, and it would specifically benefit one or a group of countries, shall we say, that might be something that we would want to keep for negotiation capital going forward. Because very often, one will find that our counterpart also has, most typically, many more of these kind of irritating, annoying tariffs. I'll just give you one example. I was on a call with Brompton Bicycles earlier, which due to, this will give you an example of how kind of annoying but expensive tariffs can be. So the US assesses bicycles tariffs at 2 different levels based on the diameter of the wheel. And smaller, Sam, I knew Sam would like this one. Sam's probably written a treatise on this one. but small wheels attract a higher tariff. And I'm told historically that was to protect a domestic children's bike business in the US. And that is the reason why smaller diameter wheels, I think, are at 11%, and larger diameter wheels is 5.7%. Anyway, Brompton produce wheels which are smaller, not because they're children's bicycles, but as we know them to be foldable and they're easier to transport with a smaller wheel. So trying to get, if you like, the US to either unify the tariff, reduce the 11% tariff to 5.7%, you could see that'll be like, if you like, a key ask of the US that we might put into a free trade agreement negotiation, we might put into a separate sort of bilateral plea or this kind of thing. And having a few of these, it might sound a bit sort of tit for tat, but having a few things in your own negotiation capital cupboard, if you like, can be quite helpful. I mean, I mentioned earlier, removing tariffs from environmental goods was one of our priorities in the UK global tariff. You could certainly, there's some of the remaining tariffs, you could certainly argue that some of those are environmental goods. We certainly haven't abolished tariffs on environmental goods. But I sort of use the Brompton bicycle ones as an example going the other way, where people have seemingly illogical or less logical tariffs on goods, which certainly are very good for the environment. And we would like to see those removed. So there's potential, but I think we'd like to see more bilateral action. You know, we've set where our starting point is in the UK global tariff. We want that to be a strong, stable sort of starting position on our tariff, a durable position, and then negotiating around that bilaterally with partners that we would reduce tariffs in return for tariff reductions elsewhere. Classically, with the recent agreement in principle on the Australia deal, you know, you'll have seen all the controversy in relation to us over 15 years removing tariffs on lamb and beef, but equally less publicity for the fact that Australians are removing instantly tariffs on whiskey, cars, apparel, and other goods. So, you know, actually that's a classic example of using an FTA to reduce tariffs still further.
Excellent, thank you. Perhaps one little note I would maybe register there is that there are obviously countries around the world which don't necessarily have the negotiating capital we have in terms of tariffs, but still manage to strike FTAs, Hong Kong, Singapore perhaps. But I'll park that there for now and move on to some of the questions we've had coming in. One from Graham Langtry, Politico's UK trade reporter, and this is to you, Greg. He says, the UK's Board of Trade is publishing its Green Trade Report tomorrow. I'm just wondering if Trade Policy Minister Greg Hands can say who was consulted on that and whether any sort of green trade experts were consulted.
Yes, I'm going to pass on that, Eamon, not least because I'm not actually at the Board of Trade tomorrow. I have to stay in Westminster to respond to a debate in Westminster Hall. So I'm not actually there, and I'm not. I wouldn't want to prejudge the report. I expect it will all become clear tomorrow.
Excellent. I'm sure they probably consulted Michael Lieberite, people like that, who I think does fairly fall into the category of a green trade expert.
Well, he is a member of the Board of Trade, so yeah, so that is perfectly possible.
Excellent. So another question we've had in, and Sam, I don't know whether you'd be able to say anything on this. We often talk about tariffs, but there are obviously other things like non-tariff barriers, and some of those are a lot more prohibitive to trade nowadays. Is there anything which you think the UK could be doing on that front to get rid of those, perhaps in particular industries? I remember when I was talking to you whilst I was researching the report, you talked a lot about immigration policies and what they can mean in terms of allowing people to come over to work on, say, green projects and things like that. Is that an area where you think the UK could be doing more? And if so, you know, what any practical examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and to be honest with you, I mean, it's not easy, but the easy part of trade policy is tariffs, insofar as you have a quantitative restriction that you can either get rid of or not, and it's quite easy to discuss. But as soon as you start to talk about sort of regulatory barriers to trade or barriers to people moving to deliver services, you start to get into quite a tricky discussion, because you start to touch upon domestic regulation, and domestic regulations will have been created for many different reasons, taking into account the desires of many different stakeholders. You also start to get into discussions around immigration policy. But saying that, it's still possible to start to maybe not overhaul the barriers that exist here, but to chip away at them. So on the immigration side, so the reason this is important in a green context is if you think about green services, services still largely provided by people. In a post-COVID age, if we ever get there, people will still be moving around the world to help consult on projects, to bring their expertise. And that is something that you can deal with in trade agreements, the temporary movement of people to deliver services. One of the issues with environmental services up until now, in terms of sort of unilateral commitments and just having some certainty around the regulatory playing field, has been that they've not really been sort of listed. It's people are slightly unsure as to what an environmental service is, what they count as, and lots of countries haven't actually made commitments in this space, so people are unsure if what the regime is, if it's going to stay like that, or if it's going to change in future. So that's something where some more work can be done. And yeah, in terms of the UK's perspective, the more liberal its immigration policy is in general, the better it is for trade. And that's true of environmental services as well. When it comes to chipping away at these regulatory barriers, regulatory cooperation, getting regulators into a room, kicking the politicians out, getting them to talk to each other, work on it, bring the politicians back in when a big decision needs to be made. This is something that takes a long time, but can hopefully deliver gains in the long run.
Definitely. And yeah, I mean, as I was sort of saying whilst we were researching the report, it definitely seemed to be a very kind of nebulous and vague area, environmental services, and what is an environmental service, how does it differ from a non-environmental service, and what are the rules and regulations around that. So hopefully some good work can be forthcoming in that regard. Ausflug, I'm going to bring you in now because I wanted to talk a little bit about, in terms of Iceland, it's obviously a country blessed with a lot of sort of geological resources, so thinking here about the power, etc. So do you sort of see Iceland as a country which can really play a big role in terms of decarbonising imports and things into other countries? If it sort of pivots its manufacturing around things like that, and what might other countries be able to learn from that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I see Iceland as a leader in sustainability, maybe first and foremost. And one of the questions we are looking at today is how governments can promote free trade and economic growth while delivering environmental objectives. That can be done through addressing trade rules, as we have discussed, but also creating an environment. Like I saw one question that came from someone that was watching, where R&D can flourish and new companies can develop and then market to the world solution that can help us combat climate change. And that is a very important part of the discussion and what we have been doing to create that environment for the new companies. And we, of course, we have much contributed in the field of sustainability because of our 100% electricity and house heating needs are met with renewable resources, hydroelectric and geothermal. And our plan is for Iceland to become carbon neutral by 2040. We have been harnessing renewable energy for more than a century now, and Icelandic experts are working in many different countries to help other countries to use their potential, particularly in geothermal area. And maybe just one more that is, we also have very interesting companies in the field of carbon capture, utilization and storage that will, I think, be a big part of the solution of combating climate change. And I want to mention the CarbFix project. I don't know if you know it, but that binds captured CO2 emissions directly into rock, where it naturally mineralizes and is then permanently stored underground. The company is now planning to start transporting CO2 to Iceland from overseas to permanently store in Iceland's bedrock. And this is just one example of companies we have been seeing growing in Iceland, and I think will be have a big impact for other countries as well.
Definitely, I was aware of that, and it seems like a very cool company, and hopefully can go on to do lots of good stuff in terms of capturing carbon dioxide and storing it permanently. I think you kind of mentioned the question that we had in from an anonymous attendee, and Greg, you might want to pick up on this, but They say they're interested in how the UK might better support clean startups to scale up and attract international clean tech companies to scale in the UK. So is there anything which DIT has been doing to sort of actively promote this?
Yeah, well, there is. And we've got a whole parts of the department here to assist startups to grow, to be able to export, to be able to access foreign direct investment. Those are sort of big parts of the Department for International Trade beyond my area of trade policy, the TPG, the Trade Policy Group. We also have export finance available, UKEF. We've got a lot of tools available to assist startups to scale up. I'm not a massive believer that the government is always the answer for this, but the government is available where it makes sense for us to do so, particularly there's no other financier available, and also using our commercial diplomacy network around the world. We've got people who will enable startups to be able to access overseas markets when that time comes right to scale up. So yes, we do provide a lot of support on top of the usual sort of business support provided by BEIS and others.
Thank you, thank you. So my next question I can see, and I'll try and paraphrase it slightly from Rod Richardson. He has asked, essentially, I think, that mechanisms like CBAMs, you could see them as a sort of a corrective to externalities which exist, and you could see them as a way of markets kind of extending market forces and applying them where they weren't previously, or you could see them as a straightforward trade barrier. Sam, is this something that you can kind of weigh in on? Do you kind of sympathise with that?
I do sympathise with it. I mean, even if we look at the EU's proposal, if you are an EU importer importing a CBAM good, you will need to register with your notified body based in your member state. You will need to calculate the amount of carbon you have imported over the course of the year. You will need to purchase CBAM certificates, and then you will need to submit a declaration and then surrender them every year. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of bureaucracy. It's a lot of additional cost. I suppose my question, though, is that it's all well and good to talk about free trade in the abstract, and we just get rid of tariffs, everyone will sell things to each other, it will be really nice. But in the real world, you have to sort of keep political support for free trade. It can easily slip away. You saw it in the US recently with the election of Trump, and that's actually being continued with the Biden administration to a degree. Years of championing free trade, all of a sudden the political bellwether changes and you go away. So the question for me around CBAM and also other sorts of conditionality mechanisms whereby is it the lesser of two evils, insofar as if you place these conditions on importing goods into your market, does it allow you to broadly keep your markets open and liberal? Whereas if you weren't to do that, would you contribute to the unleashing of political forces that would lead to your market becoming on aggregate more closed? And this is a judgment call, right? Because you can't know for certain either way. But then I would say that at least with CBAM, you do have some other positive externalities in that it could potentially lead to other countries introducing carbon pricing. And then hopefully the end result is that everyone has carbon pricing and all is well in the world again. Right, everyone's deemed equivalent. There's no need for all of this nasty bureaucracy. That was just a hurdle in the road. But it's a perfectly valid question to ask, and it's one that I wrestle with quite a lot.
Certainly, yeah, I think you get to the crux of the issue pretty well there. That sort of one person's trade barrier is another person's necessary thing to tackle climate change. And actually, sort of while we're on that point about the sort of whole political economy, something you mentioned in your initial remarks, Sam, and I think Joe picked up on as well, is that, and we can talk about things like carbon leakage, which might not necessarily be that much of an issue at the moment, but could become more pertinent as sort of carbon prices increase on the way to net zero. Perhaps, Greg, maybe you can speak to this. Do you sort of see, potential measures like CBAMs as sort of the least worst option, and maybe they will become necessary to keep that consensus on climate change going, where some people might want to undermine it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Evan. I think there's a lot of issues all sort of mixed in here together. I think one thing we do have to be mindful of course, is where the WTO might be on this. We are simultaneously, the UK, massively promoting the rules-based international system and the World Trade Organization. And if the World Trade Organization isn't keen on CBAMs, it leaves us in a slightly awkward position. I think we're also mindful, just yesterday, we launched a consultation on going further on trade with the developing world and how CBAMs has the potential to discriminate against what might popularly be called sort of genuine developing countries. I don't want to get into that whole separate debate on SDT here. So I think we do have to tread carefully. I hear what Sam says about sort of burying our heads in the sand. I wouldn't say that. I would just say that the UK, our starting point is that the best way to deliver this is to have an agreed way of measuring this before we can look at the action to be taken. I appreciate you might be saying, Sam, the world is moving much more quickly than Greg Hands and the UK with our, we want to see a common established evidence base. And I totally hear what you're saying there. What we, the UK, I don't think can often be accused of missing the boat on when it comes to the environment. And we certainly don't mean to miss the boat on this one. But I do think that we do need to give it a very serious consideration and make sure that that we have an agreed methodology, at least to start with, or more work on that before we can really make much more progress. But we are studying it closely, what the EU is proposing, and particularly what others like the US are doing in response as well.
Excellent, thank you, Minister. And at the risk of missing the boat on coming up on time, and instead of being abruptly cut off, I think that's a nice place for us to pause. Before saying goodbye, I'd like to urge the audience to follow the CPS on Twitter at CPS Think Tank. You can also follow the Conservative Environment Network at @sen_HQ. If for some reason you're interested in following me, I'm on at Eamon Ives. And if you'd like to get invitations to more events like this, please do subscribe to our newsletter via our website. All that remains for me to do is say a huge thank you to Greg, Ausloig, Joe and Sam, to the Conservative Environment Network for partnering with us on the report and today's event, and of course all of you who've tuned in to watch. So thank you and have a lovely evening.